She was sitting on the floor of a hallway in a Quincy apartment building, with her back against a neighbor's door, still in the gray blouse and skirt she'd worn to the office that morning, one sleeve torn open at the shoulder, a phone shaking against her ear. She'd gotten the old woman inside and pulled that door shut behind her. And now she was sitting in front of it, because if he came down those stairs, she wanted him to find her first. Delaney Ward was 27, and for 3 years she'd been paid to keep her voice level no matter what was happening in a room. She couldn't do it now. All she could get out were 2 words: Mr. Callahan. Above her, somewhere on the 2nd floor, a door came off its hinges. 11 miles away, on the 30th floor of a glass tower downtown, Beckett Callahan stood up so fast his chair went back into the window. He was 34, charcoal 3-piece, jacket still buttoned, gray eyes that almost never moved, and a faded scar along his left jaw that nobody in this city had ever been brave enough to ask about. Half the cranes in Boston turned because he'd signed something. In the 4 years since he'd bought that building, he hadn't once raised his voice inside it, and he didn't raise it now either. He just said, "Say that again," and there was nothing on the line but breathing. Otis Brandt was already at the door. 19 years in this line of work had taught him exactly what came next, and he said he'd send a crew. Beckett said there wasn't time, and put his hand out for the keys. Then he was walking, coat over his arm, 2 men falling in behind him, through a lobby where people stepped aside without being asked, down into the garage, out into sleet, coming sideways off the harbor. He could buy the building she was sitting in. He could buy the whole block before sunrise. What he couldn't do was move a single car out of his way. And there were 11 miles between him and that hallway. So the question isn't whether Beckett Callahan got there in time. The question is what he did when he walked through that door. Because it wasn't what his own men expected. And it wasn't what she expected either. If a story about loyalty, dignity, and the people we'd tear a city apart for is the kind of story you love, hit that like button for us. Share it with someone who'd drop everything for a phone call. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next week. Now let's go back to that February night, to a phone ringing in a very quiet room, and to the 11 miles that changed everything. That evening began like every other evening on the 30th floor, which meant it was very quiet. Beyond the glass windows, snow had been falling at an angle across the bay since late afternoon, but no one in the conference room paid any attention to it. Only 2 men sat at opposite ends of the table, with a third standing beside the door. The man seated across from Beckett Callahan was named Ansel Rourke, a materials contractor who had done business with the company long enough to believe he understood how it operated. He had come to explain a shipment of supplies that had disappeared somewhere between the port and the construction site, and he had spent the entire week preparing that explanation. He talked about the weather, about 2 trucks whose schedules had been changed, about a newly hired dispatcher who was still learning the job, about customs paperwork that had been held because of a typing error. He spoke smoothly, and the longer he spoke, the smoother he seemed to become, because the man across from him didn't interrupt him once. Beckett let him finish. He sat perfectly straight, with both hands resting on the table, and throughout that entire time, the only part of him that moved was his thumb slowly tracing the edge of a leather-bound notebook in front of him. When Rourke paused to drink some water, Beckett opened the notebook. He didn't take any documents from a briefcase, and he didn't call for anyone to bring files into the room. He simply turned to a page with one small corner already folded, then repeated exactly what Rourke had just said, point by point, slowly, in the voice of a man reading back a menu to make sure he had heard it correctly. He repeated the part about the weather, then asked why 2 other shipments traveling that same night had arrived on time. He repeated the part about the new dispatcher, then read aloud the name of the person who had actually signed for the shipment, a man who had worked there for years. He repeated the part about the typing error on the customs paperwork, then read the declaration number and said that the document had been corrected close to 4 o'clock in the morning, and he asked whether Rourke knew who had been sitting in the port office at that hour. Not one of those questions was spoken any louder than the one before it. Not one of them was an accusation. He simply placed each thing on the table beside the others, the way someone lays down a row of cards face up, then leaves them there. Rourke set his glass down, and this time he didn't pick it up again. He started speaking once more, but the sentences that followed no longer connected to the ones before them. His voice rose, then faltered, then shortened, until finally he stopped altogether. The only sounds left in the room were the snow striking the glass and Beckett's thumb moving slowly along the edge of the notebook. Beckett closed it. He asked Rourke only one question, where the shipment was now. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask who was behind it. He didn't ask how much Rourke had been paid. He only asked where it was. And after a very long silence, Rourke gave the name of a warehouse across the river, then added one man's name, then another name no one had asked for. He spoke quickly, as though afraid that if he stopped, the man across from him might no longer listen. When he finished, Beckett nodded once, thanked him for coming out in weather like this, and said that his contract for the year would be reviewed at the beginning of the following week. That was all. Not a single threat had been spoken in that room. Not once had Beckett's voice risen above the level of ordinary conversation, and Rourke stood with legs that no longer seemed steady. He fumbled with the buttons of his coat at the doorway, missed twice, then gave up and walked out without fastening it. Otis Brandt had stood beside the door from beginning to end, with both hands clasped in front of him, and he hadn't said a word. He had stood beside doors like this long enough to understand that the most frightening thing in this room had never been shouting. When the sound of Rourke's footsteps had completely disappeared down the hallway, Otis looked at the clock on the wall and asked whether he should call the car to take Beckett home, because the snow was getting heavier. Beckett said not yet. He still had another meeting at 9 o'clock. He pulled the notebook toward himself, opened it to another page, and picked up his pen. His private phone lay face down at the corner of the table, silent, exactly a handspan away from his hand. The car came out of the parking garage and was immediately swallowed by the snowstorm. Dev was driving. He didn't ask a single question, only glanced once into the rearview mirror before merging onto the highway heading south. Otis sat in the front passenger seat, with his phone wedged between his shoulder and ear, reading the address aloud to the person on the other end, then repeating it once more to make sure. The house number, the neighborhood, the second floor. Beckett sat in the back seat with his coat still draped across his lap because he hadn't had time to put it on, and he called again. The phone rang. It rang through the entire cycle, and then stopped. He called a second time. This time it rang only halfway, before going straight to voicemail. And her recorded voice filled the car, that calm, professional voice he had heard every day for 3 years, asking the caller to leave a message, and promising to return the call as soon as possible. He ended the call before the recording finished. Otis turned his head as though he were about to say something, then decided against it. Outside, snow swept sideways through the headlights in long streaks, and the wet black pavement reflected the taillights of the traffic ahead into a blurred red ribbon that stretched all the way to the bend in the road. Beckett set the phone on the seat beside him and looked out the window. And what came into his mind wasn't the apartment in Quincy that he had never set foot inside, nor the man who was there now. What came back to him was a dark hallway. 3 years earlier, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, he had returned to retrieve a file he had forgotten. Only the emergency lights were still on across the floor, and in the stretch of hallway near the stairwell, someone was sitting on the floor in a custodial uniform with her cleaning cart parked off to one side. In front of her was a crumpled sheet of paper, the kind printed on one side and thrown away by the stack every day, and she was writing on the blank side with the ballpoint pen she kept clipped inside her uniform pocket. She sprang to her feet when she saw him, and the first thing she said was an apology. Then she said she would clean everything up immediately. Then she said she knew she wasn't allowed to sit there. He asked what she was writing. She was silent for a very long time, and he saw on her face the expression of someone trying to calculate whether telling the truth would cost her the job, or whether keeping quiet would cost her the job. Then she handed him the paper. There were 2 columns of numbers on it, one copied from the discarded sheet, the other recalculated by her, and between them was a discrepancy that an entire accounting department had approved without anyone noticing. He asked why she had picked it up in the first place. She said she was afraid someone might be blamed for something they hadn't done. The car jolted to a stop. Beckett came back to the present just as the rows of taillights ahead froze into a solid wall of red, stretching all the way to the entrance of the bridge. Dev managed to move half a car length before stopping completely. Somewhere ahead came the sound of a siren, the kind of siren that wasn't getting any closer and seemed trapped in the same place, which meant the far end had been blocked for some time. Otis opened the door, stood on the running board, looked ahead, then sat back down and closed the door. He said there had been an accident in the middle of the bridge, and both lanes were blocked. Then he added that he had already called 2 men who lived nearby, that they were on their way and would reach the address about 15 minutes before they did. Beckett didn't answer. He looked at the small clock on the dashboard, then out the window, then back at the clock. The numbers stayed unchanged for so long that he wondered whether it had stopped working. In 34 years of living, he had learned that almost everything had a price, and that price was usually lower than people imagined. He had bought things outright that other people believed couldn't be bought. He had once purchased an entire office tower simply because there was a room inside it containing old documents he needed to read, but he couldn't buy the distance between himself and that hallway. He couldn't buy a single car ahead of them willing to move aside. He couldn't buy 10 minutes. He sat motionless for a long time, with both hands resting on his lap, and no one in the car said anything. Then he raised one hand and struck the back of the front seat once. Only once. Hard enough that Dev flinched and looked into the mirror. The sound died immediately inside the confined space of the car. Beckett lowered his hand, adjusted his cuff, and said in the most ordinary voice he could manage that if the bridge was blocked, they would go around, and they would do it now. The apartment building in Quincy was the kind that had been there for a very long time. 3 stories, with a wooden staircase running up through the middle, and a first-floor hallway barely wide enough for 2 people to pass each other. Miss Josie Marchetti's door was right at the foot of the stairs, and Delaney was sitting on the floor directly in front of it. She had helped the old woman inside first, pulled the door shut behind her, and waited until she heard the lock slide into place before sitting down. Miss Josie had spoken through the crack in the door and told her, "Come inside, sweetheart," but Delaney hadn't gone in. She sat there blocking the doorway with her back against the wood and her face turned toward the stairs, because if he came down, he would have to see her first. Miss Josie had opened her door when she heard the noise upstairs, had stood in her own doorway to shield Delaney, and now she was sitting on a chair in the kitchen, with one wrist clutched tightly against her chest, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. Above them, the noise hadn't stopped. There was the sound of drawers being yanked off their tracks, something plastic crashing onto the floor, footsteps moving from one room to another, and then back again, and between those sounds came Grady Pell's voice. Not shouting, not yelling, only speaking evenly to himself like a man looking for his keys, asking where the envelope was, saying she knew where it was, saying she could sit down there as long as she wanted because he had all night. Delaney heard everything. She even heard papers being swept off the table, and she knew what they were, and that was the only thing that almost made her stand up. Then the door downstairs opened. There was no pounding, no kicking, only the dry creak of an old hinge and the sound of footsteps coming inside. And Delaney looked up and saw Beckett Callahan standing at the end of the hallway, snow still white across the shoulders of his suit jacket, his coat draped over one arm, with Otis and Dev behind him. He didn't say anything to her. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, looked at the door she was sitting in front of, then went straight up the stairs. Otis followed, and when he reached the 3rd step, he slipped one hand inside his coat. Beckett raised a hand to stop him without turning around, simply holding his arm out across the stairway, and Otis stopped exactly where he was. On the 2nd floor, the apartment door had been torn loose from its upper hinge and hung crookedly inward. Grady stood in the middle of the living room with a stack of papers still in one hand, and when he turned around, he saw 3 men standing in the doorway. He opened his mouth as though he were going to say something. No one answered. Beckett didn't look at him. He lowered his eyes and took off his shoes. He did it slowly, one at a time, placing them neatly to the left of the doorway, with the toes facing outward, the way a person might leave shoes at the entrance of his own home. Then he stepped inside in his socks. Otis stood in the doorway watching and didn't understand. Grady didn't understand either. And that confusion silenced him faster than any words could have done. The floor was covered with papers. There were bills, bank letters, and a thick stack of hospital forms, test results, appointment papers, pages with doctors' signatures in the lower corners. Beckett lowered himself onto one knee in the middle of them and began picking them up. He picked up every page one at a time, turned each one the right way, brushed the dust from the edges, smoothed out the folds, then stacked them neatly together. He did it for a very long time, long enough that the only sound left in the room was paper touching paper. No one dared move. When he had finished, he stood, went back to the doorway, put his shoes on again, and walked downstairs. Delaney was still sitting exactly where she had been. He lowered himself until he was level with her, placed the stack of documents in her hands, and waited until her fingers closed around it before letting go. Then he took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, pulled both sides together to cover her properly, and asked where the old woman was. Delaney pointed to the door behind her. He knocked twice, gave his name, and waited. When the lock opened, he went inside, and a short while later he came back carrying Miss Josie in his arms. He carried her himself. He didn't call Otis. He didn't call Dev. The old woman was so small she seemed almost weightless, and she was still holding her wrist tightly against her chest, and she kept saying over and over that she was causing him trouble, and he kept telling her that she wasn't causing any trouble at all. He carried her out to the car, settled her into the back seat, and pulled Dev's coat over her legs. Only when he went back inside to retrieve the phone still lying on the hallway floor did he finally lift his eyes toward Grady, who remained frozen at the top of the stairs. And Beckett said exactly one thing to him, so quietly that Otis, standing only a few steps away, had to tilt his head to hear it. "Take those papers home with you. Beginning next week, the man you owe will be me." At the hospital, they took Miss Josie inside fairly quickly, and the hallway outside was white and cold, in the particular way only hospital hallways could be cold. Delaney sat on the row of connected plastic chairs, with his coat still around her shoulders and the file still held against her chest, and she began apologizing. She apologized for calling him at that hour. She apologized because he had been in a meeting. She said she had meant to call the police, but she had lost her phone for a while. Then she said she should have been able to handle the situation on her own. Then she went back to apologizing about the meeting again, as though out of everything that had just happened, the thing troubling her most was that she had interrupted someone else's work. Beckett let her finish. He sat down one seat away from her with his hands resting on his knees, and when she finally stopped to breathe, he said there was nothing to apologize for in calling him, and he wanted her to remember that. She started to say something else. He said no, remember that, and then he didn't say anything more. A little while later, Otis passed by, and no one told him to do it. But he set a paper cup of water on the chair beside her, then continued toward the far end of the hallway, and stood there with his back to them, looking out through the glass doors. The doctor came out and said the old woman was all right, that her wrist was broken but the fracture was clean, that she wouldn't need surgery, and that they would put it in a cast and keep her overnight for observation because of her age. Delaney sat with her until nearly morning. Miss Josie held Delaney's hand with her uninjured one and kept saying she was fine, then asked who the young man in the suit was, then said he had carried her as gently as though she were a child, and then she fell asleep. The next morning, when Delaney went to the desk to ask about the paperwork, the woman behind the counter told her everything had already been taken care of. Delaney asked again. The woman turned the screen toward her. The entire hospital bill, the room charge, the observation fee, even the portion insurance wouldn't cover, had been paid in full at 4 o'clock that morning. Delaney asked for a printed copy. At 9 o'clock, she placed that paper on Beckett's desk. He was in the middle of writing something. He looked at the page for exactly 1 second, didn't pick it up, merely glanced at it, folded it in half, then into quarters, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket the way someone might tuck away a coffee receipt. Delaney remained standing where she was. She said, "I work for you, Mr. Callahan, and I'm not a line item under the company's charitable expenses." He set down his pen. He said the old woman had stood in the doorway of her own home to protect someone else, and he would have paid for that whether she knew anyone in this building or not. Delaney said she would pay him back gradually, that he could deduct it from her salary if necessary. He didn't answer. He opened the drawer on the left side of his desk, took out a sheet of paper yellowed around the edges, and slid it across the desk toward her. She looked down and recognized her own handwriting. She didn't pick it up. She only stood there, looking at it, and for a long time she couldn't say anything at all. He said she had saved him an amount of money that an entire accounting department had approved without noticing, that for the past 3 years he had paid her exactly the salary of an assistant, and that this was the portion he still owed her. She said that had been a long time ago. He said he knew. She asked why he had kept the paper. He didn't answer that question. He only said that if she absolutely insisted on keeping accounts, then she could write it down, and he wouldn't object. But he wouldn't take back a single dollar, and he wanted her to sit because watching her stand there was making him tired. She sat down. She picked up the paper, folded it very carefully, and slipped it into her own pocket. Close to noon, Otis came into the office and closed the door behind him. He placed a stack of printed pages on the desk, turned to the second page, and pointed to a line. He said his people had traced Grady Pell's account, and that the man wasn't nearly as broke as he kept claiming. A few days before that night, a payment had been transferred into his account, an amount larger than everything he had earned during the entire previous year combined, and it had come from an account that wasn't registered under anyone's name. Beckett stared at that line for a very long time. He didn't ask how much. He asked something else, very quietly. "Who wants her out of my building?" On Friday afternoon, when Delaney said she needed to leave early, Beckett asked where she was going, and she answered simply that she had to take her younger sister to dialysis. As soon as she said it, she lowered her head and shut down her computer, the way people do when they don't want anyone asking more questions. He didn't ask any, but at 4 o'clock, when Otis was driving across the bridge, Beckett told him to turn toward the treatment center on the west side of the city. Otis glanced at him once in the mirror, then turned. The center occupied the second floor of a low building, and inside was a row of reclining chairs, one person in each chair, each with a machine beside them making a soft humming sound. People stayed there for 4 hours at a time, 3 times a week, and everyone had their own way of killing those 4 hours. One old man slept, one woman knitted, and in the chair near the window, a young woman was watching a movie on a tablet propped on her lap, one earbud in place, and she burst out laughing at the exact moment Beckett walked in, laughing so loudly that the person in the chair to her right turned and gave her an annoyed look, and she lifted one hand in apology, while still laughing. Delaney sprang to her feet when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice slightly higher than usual. The girl in the chair pulled out one earbud, looked Beckett over from head to toe very slowly, then looked at Otis, then back at Beckett, and said, "Oh, so this is the boss." "Nova," Delaney said. "What?" I didn't say anything. Then the girl held out her free hand and introduced herself. "Nova Ward, younger sister of the woman who comes home every day complaining that you make her attend meetings at 7 o'clock in the morning." Beckett shook her hand. He pulled over a plastic chair and sat down, while Otis stepped back toward the doorway as he always did. Nova asked whether he was the man who had paid the hospital bill for the old woman who lived next door to them. He said yes. She thanked him, then added that Miss Josie was a terrible cook but kept bringing food over anyway. And now that her arm was in a cast, the whole household would probably get a month off, and she said it in the voice of someone trying to make her sister laugh. Delaney didn't. She stood there with both arms wrapped around her own elbows. 4 hours moved slowly in that room, and Nova talked through almost all of them. She told him about the movie she was watching, about the old man in the next chair who snored, about how she was taking classes online again so she could apply to nursing school the following year. And as soon as she said that, she glanced quickly at her sister, the glance of someone who knew she had just mentioned something the other person didn't want to hear. Then, with nothing leading up to it, she tilted her head, looked at Beckett, and asked why he had a scar along his jaw. In the corner of the room, Otis went completely still. He had spent all those years beside this man, had sat in rooms with every kind of person, and had never heard anyone ask that question. Not because people didn't notice it. Everyone noticed it. They simply didn't dare ask. Delaney turned sharply toward her sister, said her name, and told her to apologize. Beckett lifted one hand slightly, the gesture he always used when he wanted someone to stop, then looked directly at the girl and said he had broken a pane of glass a long time ago. Nova waited. She waited for the rest, the part every story was supposed to have. He didn't say anything else. He picked up the cup of water from the small table, handed it to her, and asked what part of the movie she had reached. At 6 o'clock, when the machine stopped and the nurse came over, Beckett stood, told Delaney that the car would be waiting downstairs and that she shouldn't take the train, then walked out. Nova watched until his figure disappeared around the bend in the hallway. Then she turned to her sister and said, "He's hiding something." Delaney told her not to start imagining things. Nova said, "I'm not imagining it. When people hide something bad, they lie." He told the truth. He just stopped. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I think whatever happened was really sad, and I don't think he's ever told anyone before." It took Otis 4 days to trace the nameless account all the way through. The money passed through a company registered in Delaware. That company transferred it to a small investment fund in Providence, and that fund had exactly one client, a legal entity called Harborline Holdings, whose owner on paper was a retired attorney in Florida who hadn't left the state in years. But Harborline's registered address was on the same floor, in the same suite, as Sterling Nash's project development office. Otis placed the stack of papers on the desk close to 8 o'clock that evening and said he could dig deeper, that it might take another week, perhaps longer. Beckett said there was no need. He stood, fastened the button of his coat again, and told Otis to stay with the car. The restaurant was in Back Bay, the kind of place people had to reserve a table a month in advance, and Sterling Nash ate dinner there every Tuesday night, something nearly everyone in the city knew. Beckett didn't call ahead. He pushed open the door and walked in alone. The manager at the host stand looked at him and didn't ask under what name the reservation had been made. Didn't even reach for the book. He merely inclined his head slightly and stepped aside to let him pass. At the table farthest in the back, Nash had 6 places set and 4 people seated, but one chair had already been pulled slightly away from the table, a napkin folded neatly in front of it, a glass of water already poured. The waiter stood beside that chair with both hands clasped behind his back, waiting. No one had told him to do it. They had known Beckett was coming, and they had known before he ever walked through the door. Sterling Nash looked up, smiled broadly, and said it had been a long time since Beckett Callahan had been willing to leave his tower. He told the other 3 men to go on without him, and they left immediately without a word. Beckett sat down. The 2 men talked for about 20 minutes, and if anyone at the next table had been able to hear them, they would have thought they were old business partners catching up. Nash asked about the peer project and complimented its progress. Beckett thanked him, then asked about the small investment fund in Providence that Nash had been putting money into, saying he had heard they had a very interesting client. Nash laughed and said he invested in so many things that he couldn't possibly remember them all. Beckett said that was understandable. At Nash's age, memory was a luxury. Nash asked how hiring was going at Callahan Group and said he had heard someone new had been moving up very quickly. Beckett said he hired people in a very old-fashioned way. If they could do the work, he kept them. Nash said he liked that approach, then added that people who were good at their jobs usually knew a great deal as well, and knowing too much wasn't always good for them. Beckett picked up his glass, took a drink of water, set it down, and said he agreed, and that he had always believed the most dangerous thing for a person wasn't knowing too much, but letting other people know what they were thinking. Not a single threat was spoken at that table. No one raised his voice. At the end, Beckett stood, thanked Nash for the chair, and said the restaurant staff was remarkably thoughtful, pulling out a seat before the guest had even reached the door. Nash smiled and said that in this city everyone knew how to think 1 or 2 steps ahead. Beckett said yes, then walked out. 3 days later, at the northern end of the harbor, work stopped on the 4-building complex Nash had begun the previous summer. No inspector arrived. No suspension order was issued. It was simply that the paperwork requesting an extension of the operating permits for their tower cranes was sitting in a stack awaiting approval, and that stack required the signature of a representative of the entity that co-owned the adjoining parcel, and Beckett Callahan didn't put his pen to it. He didn't refuse. He didn't send the papers back. He simply left them there on his desk beneath 2 other files, and with every day that passed, 3 cranes stood motionless against the sky, while the rental charges continued. The workers still had to be paid, and the interest on the loans kept running. The annual fundraising gala for the city's children's hospital was held every year at the old hotel on Boylston Street, and every year, Callahan Group had a table near the stage. Delaney attended because it was part of her job, because she managed the guest list and arranged his schedule, and she had planned to spend the entire evening standing at the edge of the room the way she always did. Halfway through dinner, Sterling Nash made his way from table to table, shaking hands, the kind of entrance designed so everyone in the room would notice him. And when he reached the Callahan Group table, he stopped. He looked at Delaney a little longer than necessary, then let out a small sound of recognition, the sound of someone who had just remembered something amusing. He spoke loudly enough for the entire table, and the 2 tables beside it to hear, saying that he had been wondering why she looked so familiar. And now he remembered, this young woman used to push a cleaning cart around the 12th floor of the building across the street. He even remembered the cart, and he added that Callahan Group had certainly become very creative with its recruiting. People laughed. It wasn't the laughter of one person, but the kind that spread from one table to the next. The kind people released easily, because the joke wasn't aimed at any of them. Delaney froze. She had trained herself to smile automatically in situations like this. But this time, the reflex failed her. Her hand reached for something to steady herself, and struck the glass on the table. And the glass tipped over, wine spreading across the tablecloth in a dark stain. The laughter grew slightly louder. Someone held out a napkin. At the head of the table, Beckett Callahan stood. He didn't look at Nash. He walked to the stage, asked the host for the microphone just as the auction segment was about to be introduced, and it was handed to him because in this city people tended to give Beckett Callahan whatever he reached out and asked for. The room gradually fell quiet. He said he would ask for 2 minutes, because there was something he should have said a long time ago. He said that several years earlier, a sheet of paper printed on one side had been thrown into a trash bin on the accounting floor of his company, and on that sheet was a discrepancy large enough that if no one had noticed it, the money would probably still be leaking out every month even now. He said an entire accounting department had reviewed and approved it without seeing anything wrong. The person who noticed was someone working the night shift, someone who cleaned that floor after all the people in suits had gone home. And that person picked up the paper, sat down on the hallway floor, and recalculated the numbers by hand. He said that when he asked her why she had bothered, she told him she was afraid someone might be blamed for something they hadn't done. The ballroom became completely silent. Then he continued, his voice unchanged, saying that years before that, in that same building, there had been a woman who worked nights cleaning the floors, and she had worked there for a very long time, and through all those years, not one of the people in suits who came in during the day had known her name. He stopped there. He said nothing more about her. He said only that his mother's name was Maeve, just that one name. Then he said he wasn't standing there to blame anyone, because he himself had walked through those hallways thousands of times without ever stopping. He only wanted to say that the woman who had just been turned into a joke at that table was the smartest person in his company, and that for 3 years he had paid her less than she was worth, and that was his failure. In everything he said, there wasn't one word about her family, not one word about her sister, not one word about why she had needed that night shift cleaning job. He kept those things to himself. Then he gave his final statement, in the same ordinary voice, saying that the joint venture between Callahan Group and Mr. Sterling Nash's corporation on the North Harbor development would end as of that evening, and that his attorneys would deliver the formal notice the following morning. He handed the microphone back to the host, thanked the organizers, and stepped down from the stage. He never looked at Nash once. When he returned to the table, he pulled out his chair, sat down, turned toward Otis standing behind him, and asked whether the coffee here was still hot. She didn't say anything until the car had turned off Boylston Street. Otis was driving, Beckett sat in the back, and Delaney sat far enough away from him that neither of them could touch the other. He assumed she was quiet because she was tired. Then he heard her take one short breath, the kind people take when they are trying to keep their voice from breaking, and she asked whether he understood what he had just done. He said he did. She said he didn't. She said he had just told the story of her life to a room full of strangers, people who by morning would forget everything except one detail, the cleaning cart. She asked whether he had bothered to ask her even once. He didn't answer. She continued, and her voice began to tremble, saying that for 3 years she had lived with that part of her life in her own way. She had never hidden it from anyone, but she had never put it on display either, because it belonged to her, and she had the right to choose whom she told and when she told them. She said he had just taken that right away from her, and he had taken it at the exact moment he believed he was defending her. He said he hadn't meant to hurt her. She said she knew, and that was the worst part. Then she turned and looked at him, and she said he had just ended an entire joint venture, something people had spent years building, because she spilled a glass. She asked whether he understood what that made her. It made her the price people had to pay. Beginning tomorrow, in every meeting she walked into, people wouldn't look at her as the woman who managed his schedule anymore. They would look at her as the reason he had burned through a fortune, and they would start calculating how much it might cost them the next time they touched her. Beckett sat silently for a moment, then said he hadn't burned anything. He said Nash had been draining money out of the harbor project for a long time, that Beckett had already gathered enough documentation before that evening, and that the joint venture was going to die anyway. The only question had been in which month. He said he had simply chosen the night to say it aloud. She fell silent. Then she gave a short laugh with no amusement in it, and said that made it worse. She said if he had already made the decision, then tonight she hadn't been the reason at all. She had only been the excuse. He had been waiting for a moment dramatic enough to make his move, and tonight she had handed him that moment by standing frozen in the middle of a banquet table with wine on her sleeve. She said he had used her story as a tool, used it very skillfully, and the entire room had gone silent exactly the way he wanted. She said she didn't know which humiliated her more, Nash laughing at her, or Beckett turning that laughter into a move on the board. Beckett started to say something. She didn't let him. She said she had made her own way from that cleaning cart to that table, one step at a time, and she had been proud of every one of those steps. And tonight he had stood on a stage and told 300 people that he had underpaid her for 3 years, and even his apology had been delivered in a way that made him look decent and made her look pitiful. Then her voice broke completely, and she said, "Beckett, stop the car." In the front seat, Otis glanced into the rearview mirror. He had spent all those years beside this man, had heard people call him Mr. Callahan, boss, sir, had heard the names people used behind his back as well. No one had ever called him by his first name. Otis said nothing. He simply turned on the signal and pulled toward the curb. Delaney opened the door before the car had fully stopped. The air outside was bitter and wet, and she stood on the sidewalk with both arms wrapped around her elbows, her breath turning white in front of her. Beckett got out after her and stood one step away. He said he had been wrong. She shook her head. She said she didn't need him to admit he was wrong. She said she needed him to ask her first, just one question, even once. Then she said she would take the train home, and she walked away. He watched until she disappeared down the steps into the subway station, and he didn't call her back. On Monday morning, she came to work as usual. She left the schedule for the entire week on his desk, answered correspondence, spoke to him in exactly the same calm voice she had used 3 years earlier, and he didn't mention what had happened Saturday night either. At 7 o'clock that evening, she went down to the parking garage to get her old car, and in the middle of the aisle, Leaning against a concrete pillar, a woman was already waiting for her. Delaney recognized her immediately. She didn't flinch, didn't ask who she was, and that reaction itself was what mattered. She simply stopped, tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, and said, "I thought you understood my answer already." Marisol Vega said she understood it perfectly well, and she had been patient for months, but everything had just changed. She said that on Saturday night at the hotel on Boylston Street, Beckett Callahan had ended a joint venture in front of 300 people, and by Monday morning, Sterling Nash's side had already begun trying to save themselves. And when people started trying to save themselves, they started talking. She said she no longer had time to wait for Delaney. Delaney said she had already told her. She had nothing to give her. Vega opened her briefcase, took out a file, and didn't hand it over, only held it in her hands. She said that during the 3 years Delaney had worked as an executive assistant, she had signed documents under delegated authority. She had signed delivery receipts, payment documents, subcontract agreements, quantity confirmations, even things people left on her desk at 7 o'clock in the evening with nothing more than, "Sign this for me here." Vega said that in the file she was holding, Delaney's name appeared more often than anyone else's in the company, and she added, "Not as a witness, Miss Ward, as the person who put her signature on the page." Delaney said she hadn't known there was anything wrong with those documents. Vega said she believed her. She said she had read every line and she believed her. But what Vega believed, and what a prosecutorial panel saw on paper, were two different things, and on paper there was only one signature, and that signature belonged to Delaney. Then she said the part both women knew was what truly mattered. She said that if Delaney were charged, even if she were eventually cleared, during that time she would lose her job, lose her income, and lose the insurance card her sister's life depended on. Vega said she had reviewed Nova Ward's medical file. She said that name was on a waiting list, and waiting lists came with conditions, and one of those conditions was that the patient had to prove the ability to pay for the entire period afterward, and Delaney was the only person listed as financially responsible. She said she wasn't threatening her. She said she was only reading back what was already written on paper. Delaney stood very still for a long time in the cold parking garage beneath the fluorescent lights, and she didn't cry because she had already finished crying over this months ago. She asked what Vega wanted. Vega said she wanted the same thing she had wanted from the first time they met. She said Delaney sat directly outside Beckett Callahan's office, managed his schedule, knew who came in and who went out, and had access to places even his own people couldn't reach. She said she didn't need Delaney to do anything, only to give her what she already had. Delaney said she didn't have anything. Vega looked at her for a moment, then said she had been doing this work for a long time and knew when someone was lying, and she said it not so much as an accusation, as a warning. She handed Delaney a business card, identical to the 3 she already had at home, then said she would give her until the end of the month. Before leaving, she added one more thing, that Delaney should think about which of those 2 men would still be standing when this was over, and which side she herself was standing on. That night, Delaney returned to the temporary apartment the company had rented for her after the night in Quincy. She didn't turn on the living room lights. She went straight into the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed for a while, then pulled open the bedside table drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of insurance papers and several hospital appointment notices, was a small black USB drive, old, the plastic edges worn smooth. She stared at it for a very long time. She didn't pick it up. Then she pushed the drawer closed. On Wednesday morning, she had to take Nova in for another examination, and he needed the harbor bid file before 10 o'clock. She sent him one message, saying that the file was in the second drawer of her desk, that he could get it himself, and that the key was in the pen box. He went downstairs, opened the pen box, and unlocked the drawer. The file was lying on top, with a sticky note marking exactly where he needed to sign, and right beside it, beneath a stack of insurance papers, was a small black USB drive with worn plastic edges. He wasn't a curious man. He was a man who read other people's documents almost every day and did it without the slightest guilt, because in his line of work, information was what kept people breathing. He reached out and picked it up. It was so light that it felt like almost nothing in his hand. He sat down in her chair and remained there for a very long time, the USB drive held between his thumb and forefinger, while the port on the computer was less than a handspan away. He had known for some time that someone was trying to enter his company from the inside. He had already guessed most of it. And he also knew that the person who sat at this desk knew more than almost anyone else, and if someone wanted to bring him down, she was the most convenient door. If he plugged it in, he would know within a minute. He sat with that thought until it stopped being a security decision and became something else. Then he put the USB drive back down exactly where it had been, at the same angle, and pulled the stack of insurance papers over it exactly as before. He closed the drawer, locked it, returned the key to the pen box, picked up the file, and went upstairs. He told no one about it, not even Otis. The following week, Grady Pell surfaced again, and this time he didn't come knocking on anyone's door. He hired a small but noisy law firm in Somerville, and the firm sent 2 documents. The first was a civil claim demanding a share of property he alleged had been jointly acquired during the time the 2 of them were still legally tied to one another. The second was an accompanying letter, written very politely, stating that their client had been contacted by an online newspaper about a potentially attention-grabbing story involving a female employee and the head of a Boston corporation, and that their client remained open to negotiation. Delaney's hands shook when she finished reading it. She told Beckett she would handle it herself, that she would find a lawyer, that she would borrow money if she had to. He told her to keep doing her part and leave this part to him. Beckett didn't call the law firm. He didn't call the newspaper. He called 2 people, and both conversations were short. By the end of the week, the Somerville firm sent notice that it was withdrawing from the case, citing a conflict of interest, and refunded its client's entire retainer. No one threatened them. It was simply that the firm's largest client, the one responsible for most of its revenue for years, was a commercial property management company, and on Friday morning that company changed owners. Then came everything else. Grady's credit card debt, the loan on the pickup truck he was driving, the rent on the apartment where he lived and had already fallen 3 months behind. All of it was purchased from different creditors, and all of it ended up under the same legal entity. Nothing was seized. No one came to collect. It was simply that from that point forward, everything he owed was owed to one man. Beckett met him exactly once, in the lobby of an office building, in broad daylight, with people passing through. He didn't sit down. He placed a thin stack of papers on the counter in front of Grady, then laid one hand on top of it and left it there. "I don't hit people, Mr. Pell," he said. "I buy them," he said. "Getting hit hurts for a few weeks. Getting bought hurts for the rest of your life." Then he lifted his hand, left the papers where they were, and walked away. If he thought she was going to sit quietly while someone else cleaned up her mess for her, he was wrong. For 4 nights straight, after work ended, Delaney stayed at her desk until nearly dawn. She began in the place no one would have thought to look, with the very debt Grady had used to hold over her for years. She requested copies of the complete original file from the lender, compared every page, and found something she should have discovered a long time ago if she hadn't been too afraid back then to look directly at it. The opening stroke of her signature on the loan agreement moved in the opposite direction from every other signature she had written that same year. She gathered more than 20 genuine samples of her own signature from personnel records, bank documents, even old job applications, then hired a private handwriting examiner and paid for it with her own money. The result came back 3 days later. It wasn't her signature. And the witness who had signed to confirm her identity that day was a loan officer whose name appeared on 4 other files with the same pattern, at the same branch, during the same period. While tracing where the money from that loan had actually gone, she wandered into something else entirely. There was a series of payments inside Callahan Group's internal system that she had approved dozens of times without ever seeing anything unusual. Payments for technical consulting, site clearance, geological surveys, each amount small, each supported by proper documentation, each within the correct approval authority. But when she arranged them by time instead of by category, she saw that they moved in the same rhythm, and every one of them flowed to 3 vendors, and all 3 vendors had opened accounts at the same branch during the same quarter. She sat looking at that chart for a very long time, then checked who had given final approval before the money left the company. On Friday morning, she placed 2 files on his desk. She didn't waste words. "One file gets me out. One file gets you out. Which one do you want to deal with first?" Beckett looked at the 2 stacks of paper, then at her. He pulled the one on the left toward him, turned several pages, and immediately understood what it was. He said, "All right, the company's lawyers would handle that one, and she didn't need to worry about it anymore." Then he reached out to push the file on the right aside, the gesture of a busy man who intended to look at it later. From the doorway, Otis spoke quietly. "Boss, read it." Beckett looked up. Otis said, "She worked on that for 4 nights straight." Beckett looked at Otis for a second, then pulled the file toward himself. He read the first page, then the second, and after that he said nothing for a very long time. He read the entire chart arranged by timeline, all the way to the final column, and when he finished, He placed one hand flat on the desk and sat completely still. In the 3 years she had worked for him, this was the first time Delaney had ever seen him surprised. He asked whether she had shown this to anyone. She said no. He asked who knew she had been working on it. She said no one. He asked why she had gone looking in the first place. She said because she was the one who had signed the papers, and if anything happened, her name was sitting at the bottom of every page. And after she said it, she looked away. They worked together until well past noon. He asked a great many questions, and she answered all of them, and in several places she corrected the way he was thinking about the problem. In the middle of the discussion, when they reached the question of reviewing the full list of people with approval authority, he said they would have to review even the positions people usually ignored, and then he added, almost without thinking, that they could leave the night cleaning shift alone, because it had nothing to do with project expenses. It was the only position in the entire building whose insurance covered dependents from the first day of employment, so it sat under an entirely different category. He said it, turned to the next page, and asked her about the account at the Braintree branch. Delaney didn't turn the page. She sat perfectly still with one hand resting on the edge of the file, and she looked at him. 3 years earlier, when she signed her employment contract, no one had ever explained that detail to her. She had never told anyone why she accepted that shift either, and in the entire building, she couldn't imagine there was a second person who knew that particular fact, except the person who had gone looking for it. She worked through the entire afternoon as though nothing had happened. She answered correspondence, arranged the schedule for the following week, spoke with him about the account at the Braintree branch, and kept her voice as calm as she was paid to keep it. But at 9 o'clock that evening, when only the hallway lights remained on the 30th floor, she took her employee badge down to the second basement level, where the company still kept old paper records dating back to the years when the building belonged to someone else. The task of digitizing that archive had been sitting on her desk for months, and she had worked her way to somewhere around the middle of the 2000s. She didn't continue from where she had stopped. She went straight to the last row of shelves, found the box marked with the winter of that year, the year when she and her sister had still been children, and pulled it out. Dust rose beneath the fluorescent lights. She went through the folders one by one, and she found what she was looking for quickly, because she had known exactly what she was looking for ever since he had let that sentence slip at noon. The folder containing terminated employee records was near the back of the box. She passed 7 or 8 names, then stopped. On a large sheet of paper yellowed with age, the name field read Errol Ward, position, night security officer, length of service, nearly 9 years. Under reason for termination, 2 lines had been typed: abandonment of assigned post during working hours, and suspected misappropriation of property within the assigned area. Beneath that was a box for recommended action, and inside it were the words not eligible for rehire, along with a note stating that notice had been forwarded to the professional association. There was no written statement attached, no record of any confrontation or hearing, no signature from the man who had been fired anywhere on the page. There was only the signature of the approving authority in the lower right corner, handwritten, dark, and decisive. Delaney stood there for a very long time with the paper in her hands. Her father had been dead for years, and during the final years of his life, he had never told his daughters why he no longer worked in his old profession. He had only said, "They don't need your father anymore," and the family had believed him because there had been no reason not to. She set the paper down on the shelf. Then she turned to the row beside it, where personnel files from more recent years were stored, and pulled out the file bearing her own name. She had signed the first pages in that folder 3 years earlier in the Human Resources office on the 4th floor, and the young employee who met with her that day had said only a few things before handing her a pen. Delaney turned to the final page, the hiring authorization. On the line for approving authority, there was no signature from the head of Human Resources, no signature from the building's operations director. There was Beckett Callahan's signature, and beside it a short handwritten instruction, assigned to night shift custodial department, effective immediately. A night cleaning position would never require the signature of the head of the corporation. She stood motionless between the 2 rows of shelves, and for a moment she felt as though the floor had tilted slightly beneath her. Then she thought of something else and took out her phone. She opened the folder where she kept photographs of Nova's documents, so she wouldn't have to carry the originals, and found the notice the hospital had sent 3 years earlier, the one informing them that her sister's application had been approved for a hardship assistance program, covering most of the cost of her regular treatment. Delaney had read that page dozens of times. She had cried when it arrived. She had believed it was the one piece of luck life had ever given her. In the lower corner of the page was a small string of letters and numbers she had never paid attention to. nothing more than a reference code for the sponsoring organization. She had been looking at that exact prefix all afternoon, on every line of the internal expense comparison chart she had built with her own hands. It was Callahan Group's code. She lowered herself onto the floor of the archive room, among the dust-covered boxes, her father's termination paper lying to her left, her own hiring authorization lying to her right, and the glowing phone in the palm of her hand. She had believed she had walked from that cleaning cart to the desk outside his office on her own 2 feet. She had believed the insurance card keeping her sister alive was something she had earned. She had believed that other piece of luck had simply fallen from the sky. And for 3 years, not one of those things had been something she had won for herself. He was still in his office when she came upstairs. Outside, most of the city lights had already gone dark, and she pushed open the door without knocking, holding 3 sheets of paper against her chest. She placed them on his desk one by one without saying anything, and she let him look. He looked at the first page, then the second, then the third. He didn't ask where she had found them. He didn't ask why she had gone down to the archive. He simply sat there, and that silence told her more than any confession could have. She asked how long he had known her father. He said since before she came to work there. She asked whether he had hired her because of the name on that page. He said yes. She stood there and felt something inside her chest sink very slowly. For 3 years, I thought I climbed on my own, she said. Every morning I woke up and thought, all right, I did this. I made it from that cleaning cart to the desk outside your office because I walked there myself, not because someone carried me. She said, turns out I was only climbing a ladder you had already built for me. Beckett stood. He didn't come around the desk. He stayed where he was and said he hadn't built any ladder. He had only been trying to repay a debt, and he had tried 3 different ways before he came to this one. He said the first time, he transferred money anonymously through a fund, enough for her to live for several years without worrying. She returned every dollar within 2 days, along with a handwritten note saying she didn't accept money when she didn't know where it came from. He said the second time, he created a scholarship and designed the requirements so precisely that almost no one else in the entire city would qualify except her, and the foundation mailed the invitation directly to her. She never applied. He said the person running the fund later told him that she had called, thanked them, and said there were probably other people who needed it more than she did. Then he said the only thing she had ever been willing to accept was a job. Just a job. And he had sat for a very long time with the list of open positions in that building, and there had been exactly one that offered what he needed. He said the night custodial shift was the only position whose insurance covered dependents from the very first day, with no waiting period and no seniority requirement. He said her sister had just entered regular treatment at the time, and Delaney was facing a bill she had no possible way to pay. He said he couldn't think of any other way to put that insurance card into her hand and have her actually keep it. She asked about the patient assistance fund. He said that was his too. She asked why he hadn't told her. He said because if he had told her, she would have refused, and she knew she would have refused. She didn't argue with that because it was true. She stood silent for a while, then said he had known exactly what kind of person she was, had known she wouldn't accept anything from him, and had used that very fact to go around her. She said he hadn't lied to her even once. He had simply arranged the world around her so that she would walk exactly where he wanted her to go. And she said that was harder to forgive than a lie. Beckett didn't argue. He said he knew. Then he said there was one more thing he wanted her to hear from him, rather than discover on her own. He said that on Wednesday, he had gone downstairs to retrieve the file from her drawer. She immediately looked up. He said he had seen the USB drive. He said he had picked it up, and he had sat in her chair for a very long time, with the computer port less than a handspan away. He said that in his line of work, choosing not to open something like that was the kind of mistake that could cost a person an entire career. She asked why he hadn't opened it. He was silent for a moment, then said that if the day ever came when she was forced to use it to save her sister, he wanted her to still be able to take it, and he wanted it left exactly where it had been. He said even if the thing she had to trade away was him. Delaney didn't cry. She stood there and felt something inside her break very quietly, without making any sound at all. She said she believed him. She said she believed every word he had just told her, and that was exactly the problem, because if he were a bad man, she could have been angry and eventually moved on. She said she wasn't angry with him. She said she simply didn't know who she was anymore. She said that for 3 years she had lived on one thing, the belief that everything she had was something she had earned, and tonight she had opened 3 pieces of paper, and that belief was gone, and she needed time to find out what was left underneath it. He told her not to go. She said she had to. Then she lifted the employee badge lanyard over her head, placed the badge on the desk beside the 3 sheets of paper, and walked out, and she didn't slam the door behind her. On the 9th night, after Delaney left, Nova collapsed in the bathroom close to midnight. An ambulance took her to the hospital in Brighton, and by morning the doctor said the thing Delaney had known for a long time but had kept hoping was still far away, that dialysis couldn't carry her much longer, that the waiting list was still long, and that if they could find a living donor, it was the only path left. Delaney sat in the hallway all night. She didn't call anyone. She had left her job 10 days earlier, had returned her badge, and she wouldn't allow herself to press that number. She called 3 old friends, called an aunt in another state, and all 4 conversations ended with kind words that led nowhere. Close to dawn, she fell asleep in a plastic chair with the phone still in her hand. At 7 o'clock, there was the sound of people nearby. She opened her eyes and thought she was still dreaming. The long hallway was packed with people, standing in a line that stretched from the laboratory door all the way around the bend near the elevators, and every one of them was a man, and she recognized almost all of them. There were several workers from the harbor construction site, still wearing their reflective vests. There were 2 building security guards she used to greet every morning. There were drivers, and even the man from the warehouse department whose face she knew but whose name she didn't. Some had come straight from the night shift. Some had driven down from Lowell. Some had left work in the middle of the day. Dev stood somewhere in the middle of the line with both hands in the pockets of his coat, and he nodded to her as though they had simply run into each other in the parking garage. No one was making noise. They stood there speaking quietly, drinking coffee from paper cups. She asked one of the men who had told them to come. He took out his phone, opened a message, and showed it to her. There was only one line, sent close to 4 o'clock in the morning. No appeal, no promises, only the name of the hospital, the department, and a sentence saying that anyone who could come should come. Beckett wasn't there. She looked down the line twice to make sure, and he wasn't there. The man at the very front was Otis Brandt. He had arrived before 5 o'clock, and several of the men behind him later said that he had walked straight to the front without taking a place behind anyone, and no one had objected, because the look on his face at the time made it clear that no one wanted to object. Delaney walked over to him. She started to say thank you. Otis didn't let her. He told her to sit in the chair beside him, then sat down next to her with both hands braced on his knees, and he looked at the floor the entire time he spoke. He said that winter, he had just started the job, still in training, working the night shift in the building across the street. He said that night he had been making his rounds when he became the first person to see what had happened in the hallway on the 12th floor. He said he hadn't known what to do. He had only been in his 20s, and he had frozen there for a while before running to get someone. The person he called was her father. He said her father had been on duty in the lobby, and the moment Otis called, he left his post and ran upstairs without asking a single question. Then Otis was silent for a long time. He said that a few days later management called everyone in one by one. He said he sat in that room while they asked who had called her father upstairs, and he stayed quiet. He was new. He was afraid of losing his job, and he stayed quiet. He let her father stand there alone and take everything. They wrote in the report that her father had abandoned his post, then added several other words Otis knew weren't true, and he still said nothing. Her father was fired, lost his professional license, and Otis kept his job. He said he had never told anyone about it, not even Mr. Callahan. He said he had spent all those years beside him, knew what Beckett was searching for, knew that the name Beckett needed was the very name Otis had been holding inside his mouth, and still he couldn't make himself say it, because saying that name meant also saying that he had been a coward, and he hadn't had the courage to do that. Not that day, not any year afterward. Then he raised his eyes and looked at her for the first time. He asked whether she knew why he had worked there all those years without taking a single day of vacation. He said it was because he was afraid to go home and sit alone. Whenever he sat still, he could hear her father calling his name in the elevator that night. By afternoon, the results came back. They called Otis's name from the line, and the doctor said there would still have to be several more rounds of testing. But for now, the initial numbers were all compatible. Every round of testing after that came back clear. The surgery was scheduled for Thursday morning of the following week, and during those few short days, Nova had already started asking when she would be allowed to eat salty food again and when she could go back to school. Then, on Monday afternoon, the hospital called Delaney. The caller introduced herself as the secretary of the ethics committee, and her voice was extremely careful. The kind of careful voice someone uses when reading from a statement that has already been reviewed by lawyers. She said the committee had just received an anonymous complaint concerning the donor in this transplant case. She said the complaint alleged that the donor was an employee under the authority of a private corporation, that the head of that corporation had a personal relationship with the patient's family, and that there was a strong possibility the donation involved compensation. She said that under federal law this would be a criminal matter, not merely an internal hospital issue, and that the committee was therefore required to suspend the surgery while the matter was reviewed. Delaney asked how long a review would take. The woman was silent for a moment, then said that cases like this usually took a long time. Delaney stood in the hallway with the phone pressed to her ear, and she understood that the word long meant longer than her sister had left. Beckett arrived at the hospital within 40 minutes. He came through the main entrance, and the head of the transplant department personally came down to the lobby to meet him without anyone having to call him. In a small conference room on the 3rd floor, they explained the entire situation again. No one accused anyone of anything. They simply said that the file contained a donor who wasn't related by blood, wasn't a spouse, had no binding personal relationship with the patient, beyond being employed by a very wealthy man who had a personal connection to the patient's family, and that from the committee's position, they had no other choice. Someone in the room said very quietly that if this had involved someone else, perhaps no one would have paid much attention. Beckett understood exactly what that meant. His entire life, he had built a name that made people step aside in hotel lobbies, pull out chairs before he reached the table, open offices for him at 3 o'clock in the morning, and now that same name was the reason people couldn't believe that one of his men might give something away without being paid for it. When they stepped into the hallway, Otis walked beside him. He said nothing for a long stretch, then spoke very quietly, almost barely loud enough for one person to hear, saying that whoever had written the complaint wouldn't be difficult to find, and that all Beckett had to do was give the word, and within half a day it would be finished, and no one would ever find that person again. Beckett stopped. He stood there for a very long time with both hands in the pockets of his coat, his eyes fixed on the window at the far end of the hallway. And during all that time, nothing on his face changed. Then he said, "Half a day." He said those words in the same voice he used when asking whether the coffee was still hot. Otis nodded and turned away. He had taken 3 steps when someone blocked the hallway entrance. Delaney stood there with the hospital paper still in her hand. She didn't look at Otis. She looked directly at Beckett and said, "If you do that, she will live." She said, "But every time she laughs, I will remember what she is living on. I will sit in the kitchen and watch her eat breakfast, and I will think about it, and I will think about it every day until I die." Then she asked, "Do you want me to look at you that way for the rest of my life?" Beckett didn't answer a single word. He stood still, and a very long time passed in that white hospital hallway. Then he called, "Otis." Otis stopped and turned his head. Beckett said, "Call the lawyers." Then he said, "Don't call anyone else." That evening, the hospital sent his attorneys a copy of the complaint with the sender's identity concealed. Beckett read it twice. It had been written by someone who understood the matter, someone who used the correct terminology, cited the correct provisions, and never mentioned Delaney even once, which made it even harder to challenge. But midway through the complaint, while describing the donor's employment relationship, it listed the exact internal classification code for the position Otis Brandt held in Callahan Group's personnel system. It wasn't the job title printed on his business card. It was a string of internal codes that appeared only in the company's payroll records. And across the entire corporation, the number of people who could see that payroll file could be counted on one hand. Beckett folded the paper and sat in silence for a very long time. Across the entire corporation, only 4 people had access to that internal payroll file, and by midnight Beckett had already had 3 of them checked. The 4th didn't need checking. The next morning, he drove to South Boston, to the old church on the corner where his family had attended Mass since his grandfather's time, the church that now opened only in the mornings and was almost always empty. Fergus Callahan was sitting in the 3rd pew from the back, exactly where he always sat. Delaney came with Beckett, and he didn't stop her. He sat down in the pew directly behind his uncle. He didn't ask whether it had been him. He only said that the classification code in the complaint came from the previous month's payroll file, and only 4 people had opened that file. Fergus didn't turn around. He sat quietly for a while, then said he had been waiting for the boy to come since yesterday. Then he told them everything, without circling around it, without denying a single word. And what sent a chill down Delaney's spine wasn't what he admitted, but the voice he used to admit it. The voice of a man who had weighed everything very carefully, and still believed he had balanced the scales correctly. He said that winter, when the woman working the night shift died during her shift, their family had been the staffing contractor for the entire building. He said that if even one line in the report had stated that her death was the result of overwork, the family would have faced a wrongful death lawsuit tied to the workplace, and at the size the company had been then, a lawsuit like that would have finished them. He said there had been more than a dozen men in the family living off that company at the time, and every one of those men had a wife and children at home. He said he needed another explanation, a fault belonging to one individual rather than to the system, and what he already had in his hands was a security guard who had left his assigned post during a shift. He said that part was true. He hadn't invented it. Delaney asked whether he had known why the man left his post. Fergus was silent for quite a while. Then he said yes, he had known. He said the man had abandoned his station to run upstairs to help Fergus's own sister-in-law. And then he admitted the other words. The words only he could have added to that paper that day. The words about property, because a professional mistake could be forgiven, but no one defended a man suspected of dishonesty, and Fergus had needed the matter to end completely, instead of dragging on. He said that was the price that had to be paid, and he had paid it with someone else's money, and he knew it. Then Fergus told them the rest. He said he had recognized Delaney from the first day she walked into that building, because he was the one who had signed that paper, and he knew the family name by heart. He said he had stayed quiet, waited, convinced himself everything would eventually pass, until she was assigned to digitize the old archive, and he saw how far she had progressed, and he knew that within a few weeks she would open that exact box. He said he hadn't wanted anyone hurt. He had only needed her out of the building, and he had found someone already available, someone who already wanted to find her, and he had paid that man. As for the money that had flowed toward Sterling Nash, he didn't hide that either. He said he had been siphoning it away for a long time, little by little, trying to build a position of his own because he didn't trust the way his nephew was running things. Then he turned and looked at Beckett for the first time. He asked whether Beckett knew what had killed his mother. He said it was because she had been kind, because she wouldn't rest, because she kept taking extra shifts, because she never knew how to ask for anything for herself. He said he had stood by and watched that happen once, and he wasn't going to stand there and watch it happen again to Beckett. He said he wouldn't let Beckett be lost for the same reason. Beckett sat silent for a very long time. Then he stood, and in the most ordinary voice he had, he said the rule in this family was that you didn't touch the people who worked for you, and anyone who broke that rule left on his own. He said Fergus's ownership stake would be bought out at full book value. The lawyers would bring the papers before 6 o'clock that evening, and beginning tomorrow, Fergus would no longer be part of anything carrying the Callahan name. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten him, and no one touched anyone. Fergus asked what Beckett intended to trade in order to keep the matter quiet. Beckett turned and looked at Delaney. She stood, and she said there was only one thing Fergus had to do. She said that winter, a piece of paper had been written saying her father had abandoned his post and was suspected of taking property. She told him to sit down and write a correction, sign his own name to it, state clearly why her father had left his station that night, and send it back into that exact personnel file and to the professional association. She said, "I don't want your money. I don't want you sent to prison. I only want you to give my father those few lines back." Fergus's correction wasn't enough to save the surgery, because the ethics committee didn't need an old apology. They needed proof that Otis Brandt hadn't received a single dollar, and the only person in the world who could prove that was the very woman who had been watching Beckett Callahan for months. Marisol Vega sat in the hospital conference room that afternoon and said plainly that her agency had monitored every dollar moving into and out of Callahan Group, every single transaction, and that she could sign a written statement confirming that no payment of any kind had gone to the donor. Then she named her price. She said she knew Miss Ward was holding something. She wanted it. Delaney reached into her pocket and took out the small black USB drive with the worn plastic edge. Beckett looked at it and said nothing, and she didn't look at him either. She plugged it into the computer in the middle of the table, turned the screen so all three of them could see, and opened it. There wasn't a single line inside that could be used against him. There were dozens of files arranged by date, cost comparison sheets, photographs of financial documents, diagrams tracing money from Callahan Group through 3 vendors, then into the investment fund in Providence, then into Sterling Nash's hands, all of it beginning months earlier. From the very first night this woman had stopped Delaney in the parking garage. For all those months, people had been pressuring her to hand over something that could destroy him, and for all those months, she had quietly been searching for something that could save him, beginning before Beckett even knew someone inside his own family was betraying him. She said, "I don't have anything to sell him with, but I have this. Take it or don't." Vega remained silent for a very long time, then pulled the screen closer. She needed Nash. She needed the other name too. She signed the confirmation that very evening, and on Friday morning the following week, Nova was taken into the operating room, while Otis Brandt lay in the room beside hers, and when they asked whether he was certain, he said he had been certain for 19 years. The box of records from that winter, when Fergus was forced to open it to write the correction, contained something no one had ever turned far enough to find. It was tucked behind the termination notice, a sheet of ruled paper, covered in large, slanted handwriting, softened by time. It was the appeal Errol Ward had written but never submitted. There wasn't a single word in it defending himself, not one word about the accusation of taking property, not one name blamed for anything. The entire page contained only one question, written 3 times in 3 different ways, as though the man had kept crossing it out and trying again because he didn't know how to ask it properly. He wanted to know whether the woman on the 12th floor had survived. He wrote that he hadn't had time to ask her name. He wrote that if possible, someone please tell him what her name was. That was all he wanted to know. He carried that question through the rest of his life, through one job after another, through raising 2 daughters, and he died without anyone ever answering him. That night, inside the car parked outside the hospital, Delaney handed the paper to Beckett. He read it, then sat in silence for a very long time, and then he finally told her the rest of his own story. He said he had been 15 that night, that he had gone to meet his mother because the 2 of them had made plans, and that the elevator doors on the 12th floor had jammed shut. He said he had found another way up. He said the scar along his jaw was what remained of that way. Then he added one more thing, very quietly, that his mother had just finished cleaning that hallway floor, and that was why whenever he stepped into a place like that, he took off his shoes. Delaney began to cry, and she cried for a very long time, and he said nothing at all. He only sat there with her father's paper in his hands. On Sunday morning, she went to the cemetery. She placed her father's unfinished appeal in front of his gravestone, and on top of it, she placed a note Beckett had written by hand the night before. In it, he wrote that her name had been Maeve, that she hadn't survived, but she hadn't left this world alone because Errol had been there, and that his gratitude had arrived 19 years too late. 1 year later, Nova Ward returned to school and began her first year of nursing. Otis Brandt took a vacation for the first time in his life, 2 full weeks, and he went home and discovered that he could finally sit alone in silence. In the lobby of the tower stood a bronze plaque engraved with 2 names, Maeve Callahan and Errol Ward, and beneath them was the name of a foundation that paid tuition and medical insurance for cleaners, security guards, and custodial workers across the city, directed by Delaney Ward. On the morning the foundation officially opened, she came down to the lobby and found Beckett already standing there with 2 cups of coffee. She asked whether he had been waiting long. He said, 19 years. This story leaves us with something very simple. Every day, we pass so many people whose names we never bother to ask. The person cleaning the hallway before dawn, the person standing guard through the winter, the person who tidies everything after everyone else has gone home. They have never lacked dignity. It is only that no one has stopped long enough to see it. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stop and ask a name to change an entire life, perhaps even many lives, across many years. Kindness may not be repaid immediately, but it is never lost. Sometimes it is simply waiting for the right person to find it. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue listening together to meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? What do you think made Beckett lower his hand in that hospital hallway that day? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what comes from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video lasting health, happiness, and peace in every day of your life. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.